Welcome to Energy Week, episode 19. Ryan Ray alongside Ellen Wald. Ellen, how's it going today?
Everything's great.
Well, you're being quite generous despite the technical difficulties we've had here in the background, but it is a beautiful day here in the great state of Texas. I hope the weather's just as pleasant over there in Florida.
I actually think we're headed for a round of thunderstorms, and they say we might even get tornadoes tomorrow, so it's going to be a wild ride.
Ooh, that doesn't sound fun. That doesn't sound fun. Well, before we get to the show, I want to thank our sponsor, which is, again, Drilling Info. You can see the link if you're watching the show, which is on YouTube now, globalenergymedia.com/DI. That's globalenergymedia.com/DI. You can see it. You can sign up for one of the two offers they have. I need to check back in with them, see if that third offer is coming back around. I saw last week, if you follow them on LinkedIn, they've got all kinds of news and announcements. They're always buying folks. And anyways, feel free to go and sign up for your free trial today. Ellen? But aside from that, let's get into the news. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of happened over the weekend. But before we do that, you kind of made an appearance on this network. I'm not really familiar with them. It's kind of a small-time outfit, I guess. Can you tell us about it, who they are and what was going on?
Yeah, it's named after this guy who was the mayor of New York, I think, maybe at some point. Can't remember his name.
Let's see here. Giuliani?
Not quite. I was on Bloomberg Markets Middle East this weekend. It was, I think, in the morning in Dubai, but it was very, very late at night or early in the morning here in the U.S. To talk with anchor Tracy Alloway about my book, Saudi Inc., and also about the Aramco IPO, what investors might be thinking, and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia's upcoming visit to the United States.
Okay, well, yeah, we were a little cut in the video, but we were going to play the video, but we had some technical difficulties. We will get that linked up in the show notes, and you go check that out over at Bloomberg. And yeah, staying up late for stuff, it's always interesting. I stayed up one time to interview a professor in China at like 2 a.m., and you stay up really late, and you do all that, and it's like, oh, man, that's you're not sure if you're on your A game or not.
Exactly. But I think it went very well, and some interesting things to discuss about the reception that investors may have towards the Aramco IPO. There's some reports that they were kind of cool about, Aramco as a company. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Aramco's been a private company for many, many years, basically for all of its existence. And analysts on Wall Street have not really had any reason to follow the company like they would be following, say, Exxon or Chevron or BP. And so I think they're really not familiar with the company, and that an unfamiliarity breeds a kind of hesitance and reticence.
No, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. Well, let's get into our first story of the day, which comes to us something that broke a week or two ago now, I believe, and that is from BP. They released their energy outlook, and there was a lot of interesting stuff in here. What were some of the things that you kind of took away?
Yeah, I went through this, and I definitely highlighted a lot to talk about. So a couple of the points I thought were really interesting were that BP sees energy demand increasing, but only by 1/3 over the next 25 years. And I thought that was a very interesting and very precise forecast. But on top of that, I thought that their forecast that all of the growth in energy consumption is in fast-growing developing economies. China and India account for half of the growth in global energy demand. And I thought that was a very interesting aspect to look at. China and India, we talk about them all the time as these kind of growing economies. China in particular is seen as kind of in the midst of this transition into a consumer economy. And, as household vehicle ownership grows there, we could see a lot of growth still to come in oil demand, just not from the traditional kind of industrial sectors that we've always associated with China. When it comes to India, I think a lot of people are kind of looking or waiting for India to mirror Chinese growth. And I'm not sure we're going to see that because there are some serious differences between India and China. in terms of their expected growth.
Yeah, and one of the things that stood out to me was, and I've kind of thrown this out there before, is Africa. I was surprised. I'm trying to pull up the page right now, but the demand population growth in Africa from they kind of have a comparison between I think it's China and Africa, or maybe it's Asia and Africa, and from 99 to 2015, and then you go from 2015 to 2040. Africa is where they see a lot of growth and energy consumption happening.
Oh, excuse me. Oh, yeah, I see that now. Yeah, that's a really interesting thing that they really don't seem to have pegged, at least not in the executive summary. One thing about India that I think is very important is that in India, policy seems to really matter. Like Indian energy demand was kind of, crawling up. And then last year, and especially gasoline demand. And then, last year they decided to do this like demonetization where they were basically like collecting all of their large bills
Right.
and taking them out of circulation. And this seemed to have like a kind of stifling effect on especially like gasoline and diesel demand growth. So we kind of had this like hiccup, I guess,
Right.
in demand growth. So now everyone's saying, wow, Indian demand is like jumping. It's so high now. But really, it only seems that way because it was kind of depressed the year before.
Okay, so I got your. Let me make sure I'm reading this right. If you go to page 68 and you look at the chart on page 68 of the full summary there, I guess it is, they have a primary energy consumption by fuel. If you look at that chart, by 2040 is their projection date there. Everything basically grows. Nuclear is the one. It's kind of hard to tell if how much it grows, but everything else grows in demand, including renewables, including coal. Nuclear slightly, maybe levels off a little bit. It's hard to tell. Hydro seems to grow some, but oil and gas grow. And so all of this talk about, hey, we're getting off of coal and get away from oil and gas and EVs, you're taking over the world. BP's not buying into that, at least according to this chart.
Yeah, that is really interesting. What I think is even more interesting is that they seem to see oil demand as remaining steady from 2030 to 2040. And that's they really I'm really surprised because they see natural gas and coal demand growing more. And I really don't see how I mean, I'm sure they have a reason why they think demand for coal is going to grow more, or maybe it's not really growing more. It's really the natural gas that seems to be growing a lot more. That
Mm-hmm.
and renewables and hydro seems kind of static too. I guess I don't know. I'm just curious why they think that the bulk of the growth is going to come in natural gas and renewables, and none of it is going to come in oil. Um,
Yeah, it's one of those things where you kind of look at it and you go, okay, well, but the oil growth. I mean, if you look at it, it's kind of a hard chart. I'll pull up here for the if you're watching along, so you can see what we're looking at here. But if you look at the it's kind of a hard. We need almost like an Excel file breakdown of, of what's going on here with the numbers because it's kind of hard to gauge exactly what these incremental changes are. But when we talked last week about the base load, I think if I'm guessing here, they're saying, hey, you know what? For right now, coal is going to have to be a part of carrying the base load capacity. And if you're going to talk about the increase of Africa coming on to the almost like a first world type market, you're going to have to do the base load. I'm surprised they weren't more optimistic about nuclear, but coal
yeah.
seems to be where they're thinking things will be at for a foreseeable future. And renewables, even though it gets a good market share according to them by 2040, okay, so it outpaces hydro and nuclear, but it doesn't outpace. It doesn't look like it outpaces coal. Definitely not oil. Definitely not natural gas. And so it's going to be the number 4 energy consumed item in the world by 2040.
I really wonder if they are taking into account the growth and development in plastics and in petrochemical manufacturing, because they may have put that because natural gas is used in that manufacturing, but so is oil, and I know and I hate to always go back to the Saudi Arabia example, but that happens to be what I know a lot about. I know that they are working on building an oil to petrochemicals plant. And so they would like to convert oil into petrochemicals as opposed to just using natural gas as feedstock. And even if demand for oil is kind of tapers off in terms of what we want to put in our transportation vehicles, I wonder if they're taking into account growth in the need to, in plastics manufacturing. I mean, if you want to make like a super light airplane that doesn't need a lot of jet fuel, you're going to have to make it out of plastic.
Right. Right. Well, and I guess let's think like this. If you say you have more populations, more regions or countries or people groups, whatever you want to determine that as, coming more and more into what we're calling kind of a first world type market, they're going to use more plastic. That's just the way it's going to be. And so if you're saying that that population growth is going to increase and there's going to be more money, more jobs, then you would have a higher demand for plastics.
Yeah. I mean, in the United States, I don't know the exact statistic for how much of a barrel of oil goes into making plastic, but I know that more than half of, I think the statistic is that more than half of a barrel of oil, of the oil in, say, a barrel of oil does not go to transportation fuels.
Yeah.
And, it's either heating oils or, petrochemicals manufacturing, things like that. And, I know that the EIA has those statistics, but it's not an insignificant amount. And I think that I wonder if when they're looking at demand for oil, they're really only counting it as a transportation fuel and not as a component in petrochemicals.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, we always talk about, BP has an agenda. Everyone's got an agenda. So, and they've got, obviously, when you look at a company like BP, they're going to, release a press release, tomorrow, next week, next month, whatever, saying, well, we're focusing on this. Well, okay, well, that's based upon this report, and so you want those two things to kind of go together. And so I'm not saying they're being lying or manipulative or any of that kind of stuff. I'm just saying that it's just reality. So how they see the world is where they're going to focus their business on moving forward. And so, which means that they're kind of probably eating their own dog food, to kind of use that analogy. So if they're saying that this is where things are going, then you would expect their business model to follow in suit.
Yeah, well, that makes me want to know how much they're invested in coal. Because clearly they think coal's still going to be in the mix and more than nuclear for quite some time.
Yeah, I talked to a guy a few months back and at a conference, and he said that basically two things is from the best I remember the conversation was, one, that the U.S. should look to, coal's not really effective in the U.S. because of the price, and so it should look to becoming an exporter of coal. But two, that if you just look at how baseload works, there's just really not a lot of good solutions out there, and so coal kind of has to be that option for now. And so we got the the environmental issues we can talk about, but apart, you still kind of have to deal with this reality that maybe it's not what you want to use, but there's really just not a lot of good options out there. And so I don't know what BP's interest in coal is to either, but it would be something definitely to go and to look at for sure.
Yeah, I wonder that, but I think you're exactly right about this. And I know that there are a lot of coal companies that are very happily exporting their coal, and they don't care that they're not burning it in the United States. They're very happily exporting it elsewhere. But it does really contribute significantly to degradation of air quality and all sorts of things. So it is. I mean, honestly, like looking at this, I would say this is a serious thing. I mean, why you would expect natural gas to eat up that coal baseload, basically. But given the way people are talking, you would expect it to. But, BP must feel very differently.
Yeah, they obviously feel differently, or at least that's what they feel today. I mean, we'd be curious to see what they say next year. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's for me when we look at wholesale energy changes, like we talked about a few weeks ago with Europe getting rid of the vehicles here and the gas engines and stuff like that. When I look at all that stuff, I just sit back and go, okay, that's nice to say, but in practice, that's a lot harder to get to, because if you look at how we're going to do those things, it's just not easy to get from here to there. And so, but I don't know. So I guess it's something to definitely watch. So let's go. Let's turn to the Wall Street Journal, though. We've got our next story from there. Natural gas under assault in some states after brief rain at the top. And I see you now have, I got it on the screen here, but I'm actually going to transition the screen to show you actually holding your hard copy of the Wall Street Journal. I'm guessing you wake up, it's the first thing that you do every morning is go to the front door and get your Wall Street.
Go and I get my journal out from this is well, that's thinking, what are we going to talk about today? And I'm reading my Wall Street Journal and I see this article. I think, what about natural gas's reign as top fuel is tested. This was and now I don't want to cover my microphone with this. Here we go. No, it's a really interesting piece, which is talking about how, particularly in certain states, Arizona, California, Michigan, and Massachusetts are really trying to move away from natural gas. It seems they don't want to license the building of new plants, or they're kind of putting a halt on building some of these new natural gas plants, which is a real surprise because for a long time we've been hearing natural gas is the way to go. It's cleaner. It's a great transition to, cleaner renewables and so on and so forth. But there's definitely a real opposition to natural gas. In fact, I couple months ago, when they were having these incredible cold snaps in the Northeast, there were issues with electricity generation because there were bottlenecks in getting enough natural gas to the region because they need, to ramp up the plants,
Right.
and because of a lack of pipelines. And so I wrote a piece about it a while ago, I think back in January. And someone recently must have found a tweet that I wrote about it and wrote back and said something about how natural gas is also fossil fuel and, it's really horrible and, I should know this. And, I ignored it, but like, I guess it caught on amongst some people because people have been like retweeting it. So I keep seeing it in my notifications. This like, there are a lot of people there who don't like natural gas just as much as they don't like coal and oil and probably nuclear, although I haven't had that discussion with anyone. But especially California. And I think that this is a sign that California's electricity prices are going to go way up because they only want to build solar farms, wind farms, and battery storage. They don't want to build natural gas power plants. And I mean, think like one of the things that isn't talked about enough when it comes to renewables is the amount of space that they take up. I mean, like a solar farm and a wind, they take up a lot of space, and California and battery storage does too. And they're expensive to build, and it's not always so easy. It's not like a guaranteed thing. And I wonder if at a certain point they're going to have built so they're not going to have that security in their electricity supply, and they could, it gets hot there and they could be in for some maybe blackouts at some point.
Yeah, no, I think you make a lot of good arguments there, or a lot of good things you bring up. Especially is, there was a conference a few months back. I can't remember which one it was, and there was folks from the renewable sector, and all they kept saying was keep it in the ground, keep it in the ground, keep it in the ground. It was coal, nuclear, gas, oil. It was like everything. And okay, well, one of the things I've said before, I said again, is energy professionals are in the business of making sure people have something they can live. As you mentioned, it gets hot. It gets hot, Riley, if you're in Texas. I need something to keep me cold, and so or cool at least in the summertime. I need something to keep me warm in the wintertime. And it feels like we've separated the ability to say, okay, coal may or may not be good for the environment. We can have that discussion. Okay, coal's bad, coal's great, whatever you want to say. It doesn't matter. It's just coal is what to the environment. Okay, let's talk about that. But then you also have this realization that, okay, well, and this is, I think gets frustrating for me as people leave out is, if you don't give them coal and there's no other good option, do people die? And we don't, and so, and I'm not saying that, well, people might die, so therefore you always use coal. I'm not saying, so it's like we got to go to both extremes. We can't actually have this debate about, well, what energy resource should we use? And not all energy resources are right for all solutions. We don't need to go to a remote village in Brazil and throw up a huge nuclear power plant. That's not what's needed there. We might need some microcell technology or something like that. And we just can't have this open discussion about it. And I think when, I don't want to get into the whole climate change discussion today, but it's just frustrating because you feel like no matter what side of the debate you're on, you're the enemy of whoever's on the other side of the debate. And I just wish we could actually have a little bit more open discourse about what is the best solution, and understanding that no matter what humans do, birds and bats get slaughtered by windmills all the time. So, and so that's just a reality. And so no matter what we do, we impact the environment.
And by solar panels, they get burned up. I mean, birds literally get burned alive by solar, especially by these solar farms.
Oh, I was at a solar conference in Anaheim, California, a few years ago, and they had a book, how to like the book. I think it was a book or a pamphlet at least about how to prevent your birds from getting baked, and something like that. And that wasn't the title, but
Oh,
that was the thesis of the book. Like you're saying, they're getting fried, and that was the book. It's like, how do you prevent this? And so. I'm not here bashing solar. I'm not bashing anything. I'm just saying that's a reality. If you're going to put up a solar farm or a wind farm, that birds and bats and things like that, they're going to suffer. If you put up a nuclear power plant, things are going to happen. Humans cannot go to the environment and not impact it in some way, positively and or negatively. But we have to impact it to be able to actually live, and that's kind of my point. Is that you have to impact it, and we kind of lose that. On your point about natural gas, I've been seeing this lately too. Is that I saw someone the other day on LinkedIn talking about, well, natural gas, we don't want to use that. I'm like, well, what can we use? Because it's getting to the point where you can't use anything except for solar or wind, and that doesn't work enough. And actually, if we talk about the excavation of solar and wind, at least solar, the minerals that they get, that's not exactly the most environmentally friendly thing either.
and the batteries. I mean, solar and
Yes.
wind cannot work without those batteries. And lithium mining, I mean, this is not the, you know, this is not like a environmentally friendly process either.
Oh, exactly, exactly. And so it's just one of those things where you just want to be able to have the discussion and all sides be honest. As someone who's been in the oil and gas business for since I was 19 or 20, I've always said when oil and gas makes a mistake, just own it, don't hide it, just say, hey, you know what, this is wrong, this is bad. How do we fix it? And it seems like oil and gas has done a bad job of that at some level, and so they kind of take a little bit more than they have to. But the other side of the equation is, well, solar's great, but they don't talk about the negative impacts of solar, and that gets a little bit frustrating as well. Now let's go though to our next piece, and we have this from investing.com.
Mm.
This author here, I've heard she's been on Bloomberg, big time podcast, Platts. She's all around the world. Is pretty much an authority on issues, foreign policy issues, from what I understand. Ellen Wald
Yeah.
yeah, she's a big time. Will more hawkish American foreign policy affect oil markets? Now, I'm guessing this article was in response to maybe some news that happened last week.
Yeah, this article was in response to the firing of Secretary of State Tillerson, which is kind of interesting because way back when he was first nominated, I wrote a bunch of pieces about why I thought he was a good fit, or he might be a good fit for the job of Secretary of State. This goes in the "what do I know" folder, but but you never know what's going to work out and what's not going to work out. And the move to appoint CIA Director Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. And
Right.
one of the key differences here is their, take on the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And it's very clear that that was one of the key things driving the change and the shift. And, I did a little research into like, what exactly does it mean? Because, a lot of people are like, oh, it means the Iran deal is over and this and that. I did a little research into what exactly is going on with that. So I'll distill it down for you. This is the situation. So after the JCPOA was signed, so according to the U.S. Constitution, treaties have to be ratified by the Senate. And it wasn't likely that that was going to go through by, I think it's 2/3 of the Senate, although I could be wrong about that. It's been a while since I did actually teach civics at one point, but it has been a while since I've done that.
People in the Senate have to vote on it.
Yes. And it was clear that that was not, I think, going to go through. And so instead of submitting it as a treaty, basically the president didn't, or said it wasn't a treaty, or something like that. So then so Congress then passed a law basically saying that fine, but they passed a law called it was basically like an amendment to another law that was already there. The amendment's called INARA, which says that the president is required to certify every 90 days that Iran is in compliance with the nuclear deal. So every 90 days, he gets to basically say yes or no, Iran is either in compliance with the nuclear deal or not in compliance.
Right.
And at the same time, he also gets to decide if he will certify if it remains in the interest of the United States to suspend sanctions against Iran. That's like a separate thing. So essentially, the Iran deal is like suspended the sanctions that the U.S. has. So every 90 days, he gets to either certify it or decertify it and say whether the U.S. should continue to have like lifted the sanctions. If that makes sense. So the last time this happened, the president decertified, if I remember, decertified the deal, said they're not in compliance with it, but he didn't say that the sanctions should be put back in place. But the thought is that what may happen on May 12th, which is the May 12th, which is the next time it comes up for renewal, is that he has to do this, is that he may decide to say that it's no longer in the interest of the United States to have removed the sanctions. And so that could mean that certain sanctions come back. What does that mean? Yeah. Okay. Very, very complicated. So what would that effect could that have? So according to Snap Reporter and senior oil reporter and OPEC specialist Herman Wang at S&P Global Platts, he said that it could impact somewhere in the range of 400 to 800,000 barrels per day of oil of Iranian oil exports.
Wow, that's a lot of oil. That's a lot of oil.
Yes.
So let me just kind of backtrack here. This Iranian deal we're talking about, that goes back to the Obama administration, correct?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And so, Trump has basically been certifying this for the first year of his presidency. Presidency. He's been certifying this deal and then start of this year, he said no more. Now, I don't think we want to get into the civics debate over whether the president or the Congress should be, who should be doing their job here, but that's a different discussion.
Congress gave the president the ability to do this in this law that they passed.
Why do your job when someone else can, right?
Yeah. Could you imagine if they had to hold a congressional vote every 90 days on this?
Oh, good gosh. Oh, it would be.
They'd never get their act together.
No, especially during an election year. So, no, it would be a nightmare. So, Tillerson leaving, I'm just curious your take on him leaving, not why Trump got rid of him necessarily, but one of the things we talked about before is that with Tillerson, he's a business guy, but he knows all of these global leaders. You run Exxon, you know the world leaders. So do you think it's a case where, and maybe you might know this, did Exxon have a bad history with Iran, or do you think that maybe from the previous kind of Exxon dealings that there's something there lingering, or do you think it's just not necessarily related? Or
I don't think it has necessarily anything to do with Exxon in particular. I think that Tillerson was very clear with what he thought about the Iran deal from the beginning. I think it probably wouldn't have been the deal that he would have negotiated had he been Secretary of State, but he was pretty clear that he thought it was something that should at least be stuck with for the time being. And that seems to not be where the Trump administration really is on this. Now, this is my take, and you can agree or disagree. That's totally fine. But I really see this in a large part as about a negotiating stance. And Trump wants everyone to think that he's about to get rid of the nuclear deal.
Right.
And firing Tillerson and putting Pompeo in instead is a sign that he's really serious about this, really, really serious. I think this is like a negotiating tactic, and I can see in some ways I think it's working because it does seem like he's kind of scared Europe. In fact, so right after this happened, an article came out from Reuters that said that Europe said what were they talking about? Europe came out and said they were following steps to put non-nuclear sanctions against Iran in order to please the American president. This is like the response to the Iranians. They were saying this would be a big mistake if you do this. But I think Britain, France, and Germany proposed new EU sanctions on Iran over its ballistic missiles and the role in Syria's war in an effort to basically try to preserve the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And that's a really interesting move because it seems like a lot of what the problem that the U.S. administration has with Iran is this ballistic missile program, which they're really not supposed to do anyway, not according to the JCPOA, but under other deals, I think, with the UN. So, so this is really like they got a response basically immediately. Like he fired his Secretary of State, says he's going to put someone else in, and all of a sudden the EU is proposing new sanctions.
Right.
I mean, that sounds like a strategy.
So let me just say this, and this isn't a pro or anti-Trump statement. If you're curious about what Trump might be doing, the former co-host of this, David Blackman, he writes a daily update, dbdailyupdate.com. And now you will find out very quickly David's stance on Trump. But I will say this: if I see Trump do something like the steel tariffs, I will go read what David says about it, or with the firing of Tillerson, or whatever the case may be. If I'm curious, I don't read it every day, but if I'm curious about what's going on with President Trump, I will go and I will read what David says about President Trump, because as you mentioned, a lot of the times, David will point out, hey, he's probably doing this, and it's crazy. He's really pretty right about what Trump's doing, and so again, not a pro anti-Trump statement. We can have that discussion another day. But if you are curious, what might Trump be doing? dbdailyupdate.com is quite interesting because he does track it pretty closely, and like I say, he gets a lot of it right. Whether you agree or disagree with what Trump's doing, it is kind of an indicator. Because one thing I learned from following David's work is Trump will say stuff, and you're like, oh my goodness gracious, what's going on here? And then you kind of read David's commentary on it, and it's like, huh, okay. It's interesting compared to turning on the mainstream media and they're just overreaction all the time, and everything's falling apart. And so it's just a different perspective, to say the least. But it's interesting to see what's going to happen. I was kind of had mixed emotions on Tillerson. I didn't really have a strong opinion one way or another. I kind of felt the narrative that was being pushed, I wasn't really a big fan of. Is, hey, he's a business guy, and I'm like, he's just as much of a politician as he's a business guy. But I was surprised to see him go. I didn't see that coming. I will say that. And if he wants to come on and talk about it, give us Ellen, we'll take him, won't we?
Oh, absolutely. We would love to talk to former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. He is invited to come on anytime he wants. And I promise we'll even ask about the Boy Scouts.
He can't. Me and David actually have a little lunch bet on this, because he can't go back in the oil and gas business. It costs him $180 million if he were to go back into the oil business.
Wow.
That's the kind of the buyout or the severance or whatever the term is from Exxon. And so he's got to do something with this time. And, maybe we'll give him a special correspondent to the Energy Week podcast. We'll let him come on. He can talk, once a month or so, probably about all we could, squeeze him in. We'll be happy to work with him.
Absolutely. I think it would be a really, also a really good balance to when we eventually get, why am I blanking on his name?
I don't know.
Continental, Harold Hamm.
Oh, Hamm.
When Harold Hamm decides to grace us with his presence.
Harold's always welcome on the show. He's always welcome on the show. Okay, all right, let's turn to our final story of the day. We'll wrap it up with this. From Reuters, new European sanctions would affect nuclear deal from an Iranian official. Kind of follows up on what we're saying here. What insight did you get from this piece, and any other final comments on this Iranian deal?
Yeah, so let's look at it now from the Iran side. So we looked at it from the American side. Let's think about it from the Iran side. So Iran is in a rock and a hard place, basically, because they've got this nuclear deal, they've got their oil exports back up, but they're having a serious problem with going beyond that. They're having a really hard time getting investment. They've gotten very few deals. The deals that they have gotten are threatened. Like, look at the Boeing deal. I mean, if Trump doesn't want them to do it, Boeing is probably not going to do it, going to sell them planes. But from the oil and gas perspective, they have really been lagging. I mean, they've been trying to sign oil deals with foreign companies for basically since the sanctions were lifted. And they've been, stocked up. They've been unclear about what these new contracts are going to be. They're trying to make them more lucrative to entice these companies to come in. They've been completely unclear. A lot of people are blaming it on this new hesitancy from the United States. I would say that that's only half the story, that the other half, and maybe more than half, maybe like a good 3/4 of it, is actually problems on the Iranian end. They've signed with Total to develop a big natural gas field. Iran doesn't have, there's this big sense in Iran when it comes to oil that they do not want to let any foreigners get their hands on any part of their oil industry. But when it comes to gas, there's less of a stigma. And apparently, I just read that the CEO of Total says that if there are new sanctions on Iran, he is going to apply for a waiver from the United States even. Now, Total was always willing to do business not in dollars with Iran, which was interesting. They were one of the firms that was always willing to, not need to deal with dollars. So they never quite had that financial issue where, Iran was not allowed to use the banking systems in the United States. They never had that issue. So, but these gas deals aren't going to save Iran, and its oil industry still needs help.
Okay, first off, I've got to ask because you said it and you didn't laugh. I thought you said they're between Iraq and a hard place to start
off. That's a good one. I totally did that on purpose.
You said it and I was getting ready to laugh and you just kept on going. I was like, wait, hold on. Maybe she didn't say it or not. Okay, because that's what it sounded like, Iraq and a hard place. And I was like, that's
they are. They're between Iraq and a hard place. Oh, I feel like someone probably made that joke before.
No, I'm not saying it's an original one. I thought you'd nailed it right then. I thought it was a really good timing. So
I wish.
Well, it's funny.
I'll take credit for it.
Okay, we'll give you credit for it. Let's two things there. First off, Total. We talked about them last week about how they like working in these places that are, what we call risky to say the least. But so not surprising to hear their name again. But the other thing is, you mentioned the gas. Why is the gas acceptable but oil not? And I guess the kind of follow-up that be is, like in the Permian, you can drill for oil, but you get a lot of gas. Are there wells separate where if you drill for oil, you're only getting oil, and if you drill for gas, you only get gas? Or do they have some of those wells like we have where you can get both?
So I don't know is the answer to the second part so much because my sense is a lot of Iran's oil fields are old and aging and they need to beef up their infrastructure. They need to get the pressure up in these fields. And that's their issue there. With the gas fields, I think a lot of them are just gas fields. And perhaps maybe condensate too. I'm not entirely sure about that. But when the reason why oil is such a flashpoint issue there and not necessarily gas really does date back to the Anglo-Iranian oil crisis in the 1950s. Believe it or not, it was a huge kind of sticking point for Iranian nationalism, and Iran nationalized its oil resources from what was then it was BP, but it wasn't called BP. It was called Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. But this was this huge flashpoint of Iranian nationalism, and it was suppressed for a while, and then that issue came back out again in the Iranian Revolution, and it's actually written into their constitution that Iran has to state control of the oil resources, and so it's always become kind of this point between the so-called hardliners and the so-called moderates. The moderates are more willing to, have foreign companies come in, provide some capital, but the hardliners are always pushing back and saying, this is our oil, this is a point of national pride, and it's kind of part of this ideology. Gas has never quite had that issue for them for some reason.
I got you. Okay. Well, it's interesting. It's always interesting when you look at some, why people value one thing over another, and if you look at the gas demands, and if BP's right, and we see the price go up on some point, then maybe they'll change their perspective on that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I see a lovely set of books there behind you, and we did not talk about it in the opening of the show, and that's because of the technical difficulties. But for those who did not see, if you're watching the video version, Ellen obviously has her book cover when she talks up on the screen. But for those new listeners, folks who aren't stalking Amazon for Saudi books every day, what is the book about?
The book is a history of Saudi Arabia and Aramco. I kind of call it a joint history, or history of Saudi Arabia kind of through the central figure of Aramco. And it's a great explanation of, what the company is all about, what the country is all about. It's a good story. I believe Bloomberg news anchor Tracy Alloway, she said that she can recommend it. A really, really fascinating history of Saudi Aramco. That was her endorsement. So really fascinating, as has been said. But it's definitely a good story, and you will get a really good understanding of what the company is all about and how the Saudis have always thought about their oil company.
Awesome. And how we're getting close to the release date. What is the release date?
It is April 3rd,
That's what
so
I thought.
we are really getting close. These are my author copies that I got, and so that's what it looks like. Here, we'll take one down. We'll give the viewers a little look.
Oh,
Those who are watching on YouTube, isn't it
it looks
pretty?
nice. It looks nice.
Yeah,
And I'll say
really great cover design.
it is.
Kudos to Pegasus Books, which is my publisher, for doing a really great design.
No,
So
it looks great. And I'll say this, that not only do you have someone from Bloomberg, you have Forbes who's endorsed the book as well. I saw on Amazon.
yeah, Steve Forbes called it a timely masterpiece.
Masterpiece.
Yeah.
I've never done anything that's been considered a masterpiece, so kudos. Kudos to you. Congratulations. As we always say, I think on Amazon you can pick up the hardcover, the Kindle, and the audiobook, and you can pick up all three for full price a piece. And so, whatever you just take that three and you add it up, that's your full total. And Ellen appreciates that. And listen, folks, you don't know. If you're on the beach and you think, you know what, I'm gonna get my nice hardcover book out for spring break or whatever, and the sun's blowing around, you might get your Kindle out. And you get your Kindle out and start reading, and it's like, oh man, the battery's dead. You plug your headphones in, so you need to pick up all three. You never know when you want to get more Saudi ink.
Exactly, and I've noticed now the Audible link is now up.
Okay, the Audible link's up. I will go and check out the narrator because I've talked about that before. The narrator can really make up books. I'm curious to see who the narrator is. Because there's some, it's kind of like they have a cult following, because they do so good work. So, there's tons of them out there that do great work too. I'm just curious if it's one that I happen to may or may not stalk their books when they come out. So,
we'll report back next week.
Okay. Ellen, anything else, any other Bloomberg appearances, White House correspondence dinners, things like that you'll be at this week?
I'm going to be on Canadian Business News Network tomorrow to talk about Mohammed bin Salman's visit to the United States. So that should be interesting, what he's doing, what he's up to. And I did also publish a piece with Forbes that looks at some of the business meetings that he will probably be taking on his visit. So we'll put that link in the show notes.
Awesome. Obviously, I'll be on Texas Oil and Gas Podcast, Oil and Gas Market Recap. I do a usually 6 day a week live stream on at Texas Oil and Gas Podcast on Instagram, and then I will actually be on the Oil and Gas Industry Leaders for the Oil and Gas Global Network this week. And so I don't know when the release date of that is. We're recording it on Wednesday, so I don't know if it comes out the next week or 2 weeks. So I'll be on that show with Paige Wilson. Excited about that. And then 2 weeks from Thursday, Ellen, I go up to Tulsa to see if I am one to watch or not. I get to find out.
Ooh. We will be watching.
So we will see how that goes. And one final plug, Ellen, before we get off here. If you just, I'll be pushing some stuff on LinkedIn. You can connect with there, Ryan Ray on LinkedIn. If you remember the explosion in just outside of Tulsa a month or two ago, we did an event for Texas Oil and Gas Podcast with Oilfield Helping Hands. And it was right after that explosion happened, and it was like 5 people died? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head here. Anyways, the Oilfield Helping Hands is doing a charity event in McLeod, Oklahoma. That is that Friday after the event I'm going to. And I'm thinking about attending just to kind of give it a little bit of publicity as if I can. But it's to help go to benefit the survivors and the families of those people who died in that accident. So if you're interested in supporting folks like that, man, or Oilfield Helping Hands, you can Google their name. You can find it. We probably throw a link up in the show notes. Just consider helping that out because they are doing, sometimes we forget about those people out there on the front lines. They're doing an actually very important job. We got to get that product out of the ground, and it's a dangerous job. It's a job that you can lose your life over. So we want to try to help them out if possible. So, something to consider. Anyways, all right, Ellen, final plug for the sponsorship, globalenergymedia.com/DI. Go sign up for your free trial while the offer lasts. And we will talk to you next week.
See you later.